What happens when the most untouchable man in the city is finally seen as just a man, in a city sculpted from glass and ambition? The name Ravelle shimmered from the side of a 60-story tower like a crown forged from pride, and at the very top, surrounded by silence and sky, Julian Ravelle stood alone, 34, flawless, in a tailored navy suit, and utterly convinced that nothing in his world could surprise him any more. The city stretched endlessly beneath him, but his eyes didn't linger on the view. They lingered on himself, reflected in the pristine windows, a man shaped by power, polished by wealth. "Mr. Ravelle." "The contract is ready," came a voice, quiet and efficient. His assistant placed a folder on the desk with practiced ease, without turning. Julian replied, "Tell them I'm increasing our offer by 20 million, but I want the tech division as part of the deal." A pause. "Sir, they already accepted the original offer." He finally turned, a half smile on his lips, the kind that had appeared on more magazine covers than most celebrities. "They always do." His phone buzzed. A message from a name he didn't care to read. Another date, another perfect evening with no real memory. Delete. He'd long since stopped counting. Later that day, his silver Bugatti rolled to a stop in front of a narrow cafe, tucked between a flower shop and a bookstore. Cafe Solstice, it read in hand-painted lettering. He wouldn't have come, but Drew, the only person who dared interrupt him mid-meeting, had insisted. Inside, the scent of espresso and cinnamon clung to the air. Wooden floorboards creaked with charm, and paintings from local artists hung unevenly on exposed brick. Everything about it felt honest. Julian stepped in, drawing eyes, as always, his sunglasses still on, his steps echoing with quiet confidence. He scanned the room, heading toward his friend, when "Sorry, sir" came, a voice soft but sure. "We order at the counter." He turned. She stood behind the register, hair in a loose bun, sleeves rolled to her elbows. No makeup, no pretense, just those amber eyes, steady and uninterested. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, not out of arrogance, just habit. She gave a slow blink. "Someone still waiting to order coffee?" Julian's brow lifted slightly, the tiniest flicker of intrigue. No one ever spoke to him like that. And yet, he stepped toward the counter. "I'll have something," he said, eyeing the chalkboard, utterly lost. The woman her name tag read. Clara tilted her head with the faintest smile. "Try the Moonlight Mocha, it'll surprise you." He hesitated. "And the tiramisu. My friend won't shut up about it." Coming right up, she picked up a cup. Name Julian Ravelle. There it was, the test, but she just scribbled without blinking. "Julian, it is." No double take. No wide eyes, no change. She handed him the receipt. Their fingers brushed. Just for a second, but it was long enough to leave him wondering, who was this woman who didn't care who he was? And why did that make her unforgettable? When Clara handed him the coffee, a delicate ceramic cup, warm between their fingers, their hands brushed for the briefest moment. It was nothing really, and yet for Julian Ravelle, it felt like static snapping beneath his skin. Without thinking, he said, "Have dinner with me tonight." Wasn't a question Julian never asked. He simply declared. The world, after all, usually answered, "Yes, Clara." Didn't. She looked up, her gaze calm, unshaken. Amber eyes, like warm earth, met his with quiet curiosity. "No, thank you." He blinked. Surely he misheard. "I'm sorry I said no." She repeated, her tone kind but firm. "But enjoy your mocha. It's on the house." And with that, she turned to the next customer, her smile intact, her attention already gone. Julian stood there, motionless, espresso in hand, not quite sure what had just happened. Had he been dismissed? From behind, a familiar voice chuckled. "Wow, I can't believe I just saw that." Julian turned. "So what, Clara turning you down?" Drew, his oldest friend and probably the only man on Earth who enjoyed watching Julian squirm, was grinning like it was Christmas morning. She actually said no. That's historic, you know her. Clara Hayes. She's basically family. My cousin's best friend, brilliant, double major, literature and business, working here to help pay her mom's medical bills. Julian glanced over at her again. She was laughing with an older customer now, her hand resting lightly on the counter. Completely unaware of the shift she'd just caused in his world, Drew groaned. Oh no, don't do the face. What face? The one that says, you've just found a challenge. Julian, no, she's not another name in your phone. She's different. But Julian wasn't listening, his heart normally, as still as the skyline outside his penthouse, was suddenly beating faster. Something about that rejection ignited something in him, not anger, not ego, curiosity. She's extraordinary, he murmured, taking a sip of the mocha. It was rich, bold, unexpected like her, and I'm going to make her regret saying no to me. Across the cafe, Clara glanced in his direction. Their eyes met briefly. Before she looked away again, game on. The next morning, Julian stood in his penthouse silk robe, tied carelessly at his waist, espresso, steaming on the balcony railing. The city buzzed beneath him. Penelope, he called as his assistant entered, tablet in hand. I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Clara Hayes. Penelope, composed as always, raised a brow. Should I be concerned, sir? Market research, he said, smoothly, waving her off. I'm considering buying Cafe Solstice. She didn't buy it, but after 7 years, she knew when not to ask questions. You'll have your file by noon. And she did. Clara Evelyn Hayes, 28, single. Graduated top of her class from Eastbridge University, double major, working on a master's in creative writing. Barista 5 days a week at Cafe Solstice. Full-time caregiver to her mother, who'd suffered a stroke. On weekends, she volunteers at a local literacy program. No scandals, no secrets, just a quiet, persistent strength. Julian read every word twice, then stood by the window, staring out as the sun lowered behind the skyline. She's just a girl, he muttered. This is absurd. But deep down he already knew. Clara Hayes wasn't just anything. She was the one woman in a city full of yeses, who had dared to say no, and that made her unforgettable. Fascinating, murmured Julian Ravelle, eyes tracing a photo of Clara Hayes, mid-laugh at what looked like a neighborhood block party. No filters, no careful angles, just sunlight in her curls and something effortless in her joy. She has almost no digital footprint, Penelope noted, placing the folder back on his desk. No Instagram, barely uses Facebook, no TikTok. She seems to value her privacy. Julian leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. So she's a ghost in a world of performers. Interesting. She's also drowning in debt, Penelope continued, less enthused. Medical bills from her mother's stroke. Student loans, and the family home is under a second mortgage. She paused. Sir, whatever you're planning, that'll be all. Penelope, he interrupted, his voice gentler than usual. Once alone, Julian stared at the candid photo again. He could fix everything. Sign a check, pay off the house, erase the debt. He'd done it before. But somehow he already knew. That's not the kind of woman she is. No, Clara Hayes wouldn't be one with money. If he wanted a way in, he'd have to do something entirely unfamiliar, earn it. The next morning, Julian returned to Cafe Solstice dressed not in tailored suits, but in jeans and a soft gray button-up, still designer, just muted. He waited in line amid students and construction workers and tourists watching Clara glide behind the counter, with effortless grace juggling espresso orders and heartfelt hellos with equal skill. A pencil was tucked in her bun. Again she looked tired, but somehow radiant. When it was finally his turn, He stepped forward with a quiet, "Good morning." Clara glanced up, registering him. "Julian, right? You remembered," he said, unable to hide the hint of satisfaction. "It's literally my job," she replied, though there was a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Moonlight mocha." "Exactly." And he hesitated. A recommendation bookwise that caught her attention. She tilted her head, curiosity rising. "You read?" "I'm trying," he said truthfully. "But if you must know, I'm trying to evolve beyond financial reports and Forbes lists." She laughed. "And you want my help? To, what, redeem your soul through fiction." Something like that. There was a pause, a subtle shift in the air as she studied him. Really studied him. 2 blocks east, Indigo Books. Ask for Eleanor. Tell her I sent you. Ask for the emergency literary transfusion package. Julian grinned. That sounds oddly surgical. She has excellent bedside manner. He took the receipt she handed him and noticed she'd scribbled the shop's name across the back in curling handwriting. Something about that small act felt intimate. "Thank you," he said. "Then with deliberate softness, maybe I can tell you what I think of the books." Over dinner, just like that, her eyes cooled. "I still don't date customers," she said, her voice even, especially persistent ones. "Not a date," he said, lifting his hands in surrender. "A literary discussion. I swear, strictly intellectual. I could use the stimulation." She stared at him for a moment longer, as if searching for cracks beneath the charm. "Try the books first," she said at last. "If you actually read them, really read them, maybe we can talk here, not dinner." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And for Julian Ravelle, that was a win. That afternoon, he found himself standing inside Indigo Books, surrounded by the warm scent of aged paper and lavender. The shelves, stretched tall, worn with use. Eleanor, a silver-haired woman with piercing eyes, looked him up and down like she'd seen 100 men like him and wasn't impressed. "She sent you, did she?" "I believe I've been prescribed something," he said with a smile. She didn't return it. Instead, she handed him a brown paper bag containing 5 books, a novel on immigration, a Russian tragedy, a sci-fi odyssey, on identity, a historical fiction drenched in revolution, and a worn poetry collection held together with tape. "This is Clara's test," Eleanor said, voice low and knowing. "She sends people here when she's not sure if they're worth the story." Julian turned the poetry collection over in his hands. "So this tells her who I am." "No," Eleanor said, smiling for the first time. "It tells you who you are." Julian didn't bristle when Eleanor chuckled. He leaned in. "And if I actually finish all 5, she arched a silver brow. "No one ever does. That's part of the test, too." Her eyes twinkled. "It's not just about what you start. It's about which ones you finish." That night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Julian Ravelle skipped the invitation, only gala, turned down a luxury suite dinner, and sat instead in the quiet hush of his library. 5 books stacked before him, a fire casting soft shadows across the room. And he read, not scanned, not highlighted for leverage, but read across town, in a narrow apartment above a laundromat. Clara Hayes sat by her mother's bedside. The rhythm of the oxygen machine pulsed softly in the background. Her mother, thinner now, quieter since the stroke, turned her head toward Clara. "Tell me about the man," she said. Clara blinked. "What man?" "The one who keeps showing up in your stories lately," her mother said, gently smiling with only half her face, the one from the cafe. Clara rolled her eyes. "He's nobody. Just someone who's not used to hearing." "No, I've seen his face before," her mother murmured. "On the news. A magazine." "Maybe," Clara said with a shrug, "one of those faces." But her mother's eyes grew serious. "Mia, listen to me. Be careful with men who look at women like puzzles to solve. They either fall in love too deeply, or they break things." Clara kissed her mother's forehead. Neither is happening. Yet that night, as she dozed on the couch, her mind kept wondering, not whether he'd read the books, but which one he'd returned to, because that's how you could tell. The one you kept rereading, that's the one that mattered. 2 weeks passed, no texts, no appearances, no overconfident smiles. Through the cafe door, and then one quiet Tuesday afternoon, just as the cafe's usual rush faded into lull, the door chimed. Clara was bent over a table, wiping down a ring of dried milk foam. When she heard the voice, turns out the Russian didn't have to jump. He just needed to be honest. She straightened, startled. Julian Ravelle stood by the door, holding a canvas bag of worn books, and wearing a look that was far softer than his usual smirk. He wore jeans, no watch, no entourage. "You read Dostoevsky?" she asked, disbelief flickering across her face. He walked over and gently set the bag on a nearby table. "All 5, cover to cover. You're kidding." Eleanor was scandalized when I came back for the poetry, he said with a grin. Apparently that's where most people quit. Clara stared at him for a beat, torn between suspicion and the uncomfortable sensation of being impressed. Finally, she nodded to the seat across from her. "Sit, I'm on break." Julian tried not to look too pleased as he sank into the chair. He told himself this was part of the plan. He was still in control, still one move ahead. But as she brewed 2 cups and brought his, with a quiet, "No sugar, right?" he felt the narrative slipping out of his hands. "So," Clara said, curling her fingers around her mug. "Which one stuck with you?" Julian hesitated, then answered truthfully. "The sci-fi," he said, "about memories, how what we remember shapes who we are, how much we lose when we forget who we were." He looked down. Unsettling stuff. Clara tilted her head. "Most people pick the historical romance." "It's safer. I don't do safe," he replied without the usual bravado. A beat passed. Then she said it. "You know, I Googled you." Julian froze, mid-sip. "I know who you are, Mr. Ravelle." He set his mug down slowly. "And you still gave me the book test? I wanted to know if there was anything underneath the headlines," she said evenly. If there was a person somewhere behind the boardrooms and billion-dollar mergers, she looked at him, then added, "You surprised me." Julian didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. For the first time in a long time, he just listened. Clara took a slow sip of her coffee, then looked across the table, calm but unreadable. "I'm still deciding about you," she said. Julian offered a half-smile, suddenly on unfamiliar ground. "And you're the mystery writer with a beautiful soul. Is that the full story?" Something shifted behind Clara's eyes. "My mom had a stroke 3 years ago," she said, voice level. "We lost almost everything to the hospital bills. I put my degree on pause, took any job I could. Stump, wait tables tutor, over, entitled kids, right at night if I'm lucky." There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth, laid bare. Julian felt a pang of something sharp. He already knew every detail from Penelope's dossier, but hearing it from Clara's mouth felt like a confession he hadn't earned. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Don't be," she replied. "She's fighting every day. I'd do it all again. You love her a lot," he said. "That's what family is, isn't it?" Clara asked, tilting her head. "Do you have one?" Julian hesitated. "My father, we don't really connect." Why? Her gaze didn't flinch. He could have deflected, could have lied, but instead he admitted. "He thinks I gave up everything good in me to become a mirror of him, that I lost myself to ambition." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Sounds complicated." He exhaled. "Isn't everything?" From there, the walls seemed to fall away. One topic bled into the next. Books' childhoods, the things they dreamed of doing, if life hadn't stepped in and rewritten the rules. Before he knew it, he was telling her about the foundation he funded quietly in his mother's name. The one that planted trees in fire-ravaged communities. How he wore the armor of arrogance. Because it shielded him from his father's disappointment, time bent, the coffee cooled. Clara glanced at her watch and stood suddenly. I have to get back. Have dinner with me, Julian said, rising too, this time not from ego, but from hope. No games, no strategies, just dinner. Clara hesitated. This still feels like a game, she said softly. Why would a man like you want anything real with someone like me? Before Julian could respond, the cafe door burst open. Clara, a girl called breathlessly. The agency called. Your mom? She slipped, trying to get to the bathroom. They took her to Memorial. The color drained from Clara's face. God, I have to. She fumbled with her apron. My car's outside, Julian said without thinking. Let me take you. She blinked, surprised, but she didn't argue. Thank you, she said. The drive was quiet, tense. Clara sat still, in the passenger seat of Julian's luxury car, her fingers clenching and unclenching as she made call after call, checking for updates. Julian pushed the speed limit, weaving through traffic, flashing his credentials to bypass a roadblock. He didn't speak. He just got her there in the hospital lot. Clara unbuckled her seatbelt, but paused, hand on the door. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice brittle. Julian didn't answer right away, because he wasn't sure what the answer was anymore. This hadn't been part of the plan, because you need someone right now, he said, quietly. And I can be that someone. Clara looked at him for a long moment, eyes searching. Then she nodded once. Thanks. She reached for the handle. Wait, Julian said gently, catching her wrist. Let me help with the bills. Her expression hardened, like glass. So that's what this is, she said, voice low. The Billionaire'S rescue fantasy. No, Julian said quickly. Clara, it's not that I don't need a hero, Mr. Ravelle. I just need to see my mother. She pulled her hand away and walked toward the sliding glass doors, her spine straight, her shoulders squared, carrying the weight, alone as always. And Julian sat there, watching her vanish into the hospital, unsure for the first time whether he had just tried to help or hurt. Clara straightened her shoulders and disappeared through the hospital doors, leaving Julian alone in his luxury car, staring after her with an unfamiliar ache in his chest. He was used to getting what he wanted, deals, influence, admiration. But here he was, for the first time wanting something no amount of money could buy her respect. Inside the small, bright hospital room, Clara sat beside her mother's bed, holding her hand gently. Elena Hayes gave her daughter a long, knowing look. What's weighing on you, my little firecracker? It's nothing, Mama, Clara murmured. Just a complicated customer. Elena's lips twitched in amusement. The handsome one you mentioned, the one with the impossible reading list. Clara let out a reluctant laugh. How did you know? Because only matters of the heart make my practical daughter look so lost. Elena patted Clara's hand affectionately. Sometimes, Mija, the roughest roads lead you right where you're meant to go. Meanwhile, out in the sterile waiting room, Julian Ravelle stared blankly at the floor, grappling with a realization he hadn't expected. He didn't want to rescue Clara Hayes. He wanted her to choose him freely, without obligation or pity. And for the first time in his carefully curated life, he wanted something that couldn't be bought, negotiated, or demanded. He wanted her 1 week past. Every morning, Julian found himself back at Luna's cafe. Every morning, Clara took his order with perfect politeness and no trace of anything personal. No smiles, meant only for him, no lingering glances, no small talk, just a cup of coffee and a courteous nod. She's got you on the ropes, man, Harrison said one afternoon, watching Julian sulk into his untouched espresso. Julian scowled. I'm not sulking. I'm recalibrating, Harrison laughed. Yeah, sure. That's why you've read every dusty classic she recommended, and why you've turned down 3 bombshells this week. Without blinking, Julian's jaw clenched. Across the room, Clara crouched to pick up a dropped toy for a young mother juggling twins, her face lighting up with a genuine, warm laugh. "You're different with her, Jules," Harrison said, suddenly serious. "You're not Julian Ravelle. Mogul with her. You're just you." Julian dragged a hand through his hair, unsettled. Had he really dropped the armor without noticing, and why didn't that terrify him the way it should? "I need to do something real," he muttered finally. "Something that shows her. This isn't a game." Harrison raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You actually care about her, don't you?" Before Julian could find an answer, the cafe door swung open, and a ripple of awareness spread through the room. A tall, imposing man, in an impeccable tailored suit, strode inside, exuding authority, like a second skin. Harrison groaned under his breath. "Oh, great. That's Dominic Ravelle. Your father. What the hell's he doing here?" Julian stiffened instantly, his stomach turned to ice. Dominic's sharp gaze zeroed in on their table, and in 3 long strides, he was looming over them. "You've been ignoring my calls," his father said coolly, without greeting. "You missed 2 board meetings and delayed the Westbridge acquisition. The board is questioning your commitment." Julian leaned back, a smile that didn't reach his eyes curling at his mouth. "Good afternoon to you too, father. Care for a coffee?" Dominic's mouth twisted in disdain. "I didn't come for small talk. Whatever this little distraction is, it ends now. Get back to work." The unspoken implication hung in the air like a knife. "You're disappointing me again." Julian's jaw tightened, but this time, for once, he didn't feel the need to scramble for his father's approval. For the first time in his life, he had someone else he wanted to fight for. And he wasn't about to walk away from that. Julian didn't need to turn his head to feel Clara's eyes flicker toward him, the weight of her gaze anchoring him as his father's disapproval hung heavy in the air. Keeping his voice level, Julian said, "I'm taking a personal leave. The company will survive a few weeks without me." Dominic Ravelle's mouth twisted in thinly veiled disdain. "This is about a woman, isn't it?" His sharp gaze swept the cafe, taking in the humble surroundings like they were a personal affront. And then his cold eyes landed on Clara. Recognition and judgment flared in them. "Really, Julian?" A waitress, Julian's blood burned hot under his skin. "She's a literature graduate student," he said tightly, "and my private life isn't up for boardroom discussions. It becomes my business when it threatens Ravelle Global." Dominic countered. "I didn't build an empire for you to throw it away over a fortune seeker." Julian stood slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "Careful, father. Don't finish that sentence." The entire cafe had fallen into an uncomfortable hush. Julian could feel every pair of eyes locked on them, but all he cared about was the way Clara was staring. Her face unreadable. Dominic straightened his tie unbothered. "End this foolishness and return to your duties. If not, I'll rally the board you have until tomorrow." Without another word, he turned and left, the sound of the door slamming behind him, slicing the silence like a blade. Harrison placed a steadying hand on Julian's arm. "You good?" "No," Julian exhaled, sharply, raking his fingers through his hair. "I need to find Clara," but when he turned toward the counter, she was already gone. One of the other baristas offered an awkward explanation. She'd taken the rest of her shift off that night. Julian sat alone in the soaring darkness of his penthouse, nursing a forgotten glass of scotch as the city shimmered indifferently below. His phone vibrated again and again, with texts from board members, urgent calls from his father. He ignored them all. Instead, he opened his laptop, and there it was, a file he'd buried years ago, the Lumina Project, a vision he had once dared to dream, a chain of literary cafes, part bookstore, part sanctuary, designed to nurture communities through storytelling, reading programs, and shared creativity. His professors had called it inspiring, but impractical. His father had dismissed it. Without a glance, Julian stared at the old blueprint, something fierce and stubborn rekindling inside him. By dawn, Julian had made two decisions. He would not yield to his father's threats, and he would show Clara Hayes who he truly was not, through empty gestures, but through something real. The next day, Julian didn't return to Luna's cafe. Instead, he found himself at the community center on the east side, the place where Clara spent her weekends teaching literacy to adults. He slipped in quietly during a class, unnoticed among the handful of volunteers and students. There she was at the front of the room, not in a designer dress or bathed in golden light, but alive, vibrant, her eyes shining as she helped a young man sound out a complicated sentence. Her encouragement was fierce and gentle. All at once, her whole being focused on the triumphs of others. Julian stood at the back, utterly still, watching her in a way he had never watched anyone before. When the session finally ended and the last student shuffled out, he stepped forward. "You're incredible," he said, his voice low. Clara turned, startled. The familiar wariness hardened her features. "Julian, what are you doing here? I wanted to see you," he said, honestly. "Doing something that matters?" Julian offered her a quiet smile. "I've been thinking about what you said at the hospital about not wanting charity. You were right." Clara crossed her arms, guarded. "I saw your father yesterday. By the way," she said, voice cool, "the resemblance is unfortunate." Julian winced. "Only on the surface, I hope." "He made it very clear how little he thinks of people like me," Clara added, and though her tone was steady, the hurt behind her words was unmistakable. Julian stepped closer, his voice softer. "I'm not my father, Clara. And I wanted to show you something." He handed her a slim folder. Warily, Clara opened it. As she read, her brow furrowed, the suspicion in her eyes gradually giving way to surprise. Then something close to genuine intrigue. "Literary cafes," she said, glancing up at him. "Spaces for free events. Writing workshops. Community reading programs." Julian nodded. "I wrote that business plan years ago, before I let other ambitions get in the way. I've already secured 3 locations, neighborhoods where libraries are scarce. I'm moving forward with it." He hesitated, the next words feeling heavier than any he had spoken before. "And I want you to be a part of it." Clara stared at him, unsure if she heard right. "A real partner, Clara, equal stake, equal voice. Your name on everything right next to mine." He held her gaze without flinching. "This isn't about pity or charity or romance. This is about building something that matters, something real together." For the first time since they'd met, Clara seemed truly caught off guard. "Why me?" she whispered. Julian's smile was a little rueful. "Because you reminded me of who I used to be, before the titles, before the boardrooms. And because I believe we'd make a hell of a team." Clara closed the folder, thoughtful. "I need time to think." "Take all the time you want," Julian said, stepping back. But before he left, he added casually, "Oh, and there's one more thing." He pulled a small envelope from the folder. "A full-time home care service for your mother. Top-rated, funded through a grant. My mother's foundation set up years ago for families in need. No charity, just connecting you to resources that already exist." As he turned to leave, Clara's voice called after him, "Julian." He stopped. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not for the project, not for the healthcare, for seeing me." A slow, genuine smile broke across Julian's face. That he said quietly was the easiest part. Later that night, Clara sat in the cozy living room beside her mother, turning the proposal folder over in her hands. After hearing everything, Elena Hayes smiled knowingly. "He's in love with you," her mother said gently. "Mama, it's business," Clara protested, even as her heart thudded painfully in her chest. "No man moves mountains for business alone." Elena chuckled, reaching out to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Especially not one who looks at you the way he does." Clara laughed, weakly, staring down at the papers. "What are you going to do, mi corazón?" her mother asked. Clara didn't answer right away. For so long she'd kept her world, small and safe, convinced that dreaming too big only led to heartbreak. But somewhere along the way, Julian Ravelle had slipped past all her walls into her thoughts, her laughter, her hope. Finally, Clara whispered, "I don't know," Elena smiled. "I think you do, darling. I think you always have. 3 days passed. No call, no visit, no message. Julian buried himself in the new project, throwing everything he had into building what he dreamed of, but always listening for the sound of a door opening waiting for her. The past few days had changed everything, Julian Ravelle. Threw himself into building something real, scouting locations, refining business plans, and to the stunned disbelief of Wall Street, announcing his decision to step away from the daily operations of Ravelle International to pursue a personal project. The business world exploded with rumors. Stock prices dipped, briefly, before recovering. Publicly, Richard Ravelle praised his son's vision. Privately, he seethed. Julian tuned it all out. For once, he wasn't living for boardrooms or headlines. He was building something that actually mattered to him. On the fourth day, deep in a maze of architectural plans in his penthouse office, his phone buzzed with a security alert. "Send them up," he said distractedly, assuming it was Harrison, or perhaps his lawyer. But when the elevator doors opened, it was Clara. She stepped into the vast open space, sunlight catching in her loose curls, her simple sundress brushing her knees. She froze for a second, taking it all in, the gleaming floors, the breathtaking city view, the quiet luxury that seemed a world away from her life. Julian stood, papers forgotten. "You have a nice view," Clara said, trying for lightness, though the way she twisted the strap of her bag gave her away. Very cold and expensive. Julian rubbed the back of his neck, sheepish. "It came this way. I never paid much attention to decorating. That explains the lonely bookshelf," she said, spotting a sleek wall unit with a few carefully curated volumes. "I'm planning to fix that," he said, smiling slightly. "I have a few new favorites now." He motioned to the couch. "Can I get you something to drink?" Clara shook her head. "No, thanks." She stayed standing, clutching a notebook. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she began, her voice steady but serious. Julian's heart tightened, bracing for a polite decline. "I have a few conditions," Clara continued, flipping open her notebook, filled with tidy handwriting. "First, the money. I can't match your investment, but I want to contribute meaningfully. I'll use the small inheritance my grandmother left me. It's not much by your standards, but it's important to me that I'm an equal partner." Julian blinked, genuinely surprised. "And moved. I wouldn't expect anything less," he said quietly. "Second," Clara said, tapping the page, "the mission sliding scale. Pricing. No one turned away for lack of money. Community events. Stay free, no matter what. And we hire local, with real living wages and benefit." A slow, genuine smile spread across Julian's face. "You're saying yes?" he asked carefully. Clara finally lifted her gaze to his, something steady and bright. "There. I'm considering it." She hesitated, then added, "But there's something else we have to be clear about first." "What's that?" Julian asked, even though he already had a guess. She gestured between them. "This whatever's happening between us, I need to know. Is this business partnership really about the project, or just another way for you to get closer to me?" Julian crossed the distance between them until only a breath of space remained. "Would it be so terrible," he murmured, "if it were both?" Clara's breath caught. I don't mix business with whatever this is," she said, but her voice wavered. "Neither did I," Julian said, his voice softer now, "until you." He reached for her hand but didn't force it. Just let the moment hang there between them. "I won't lie to you, Clara. I want this project to succeed, but yes, I also want you more than that." Her eyes flashed with uncertainty. "You barely even know me." Julian's voice dropped lower, more intimate. "I know enough I know you're fierce and stubborn and brilliant. I know you put everyone else first without thinking twice. I know you're stronger than anyone gives you credit for, and I know that somehow, somewhere, along the way, you became the person I don't want to imagine my future without Clara. Stared at him, heart thudding. She had been so careful for so long, but Julian Ravelle, the man she had written off as a spoiled billionaire, was standing there with nothing between them but honesty. And it terrified her how much she wanted to believe him. You have this way, Julian said quietly, his voice raw of seeing right through the surface, of calling out the truth and people. He took a breath, steadying his voice, and for the first time in my life, I'm terrified. Not of losing a deal or control or my name in the press, but of failing, because what I want most, now, isn't something I can buy or manipulate. Clara's eyes, that stormy amber he hadn't been able to stop thinking about, searched his face. "And what is it that you want?" she asked. Julian swallowed hard. "The chance to be someone you can believe in, that's it. Whether that means being your partner in business, your friend, or more. I just want the chance to prove who I really am." The air between them felt alive. Not with tension, but with something deeper, a pause full of breathless, silent understanding. Clara's notebook slipped from her hand, forgotten. Her voice when it came was soft, but sure. "Do you know why I turned you down that first day?" she asked. Julian shook his head, slowly. "Because you looked at me like I was a prize, just another thing to win." Her voice trembled. "And I've spent my whole life fighting to be seen as more than that." Julian's gaze didn't waver. He stepped closer, his hand lifting gently to her cheek. "I see you now," he whispered. "Every complicated, beautiful, stubborn part of you. Time seemed to still years of walls, habits, masks all melting in the quiet recognition between two people, finally daring to be vulnerable." Then the sharp ring of Julian's phone shattered the moment like glass. He didn't move, didn't even blink, but Clara stepped back, the magic broken, her cheeks flushed with emotion. "You should get that," she murmured, bending down to retrieve her notebook, silently scolding herself for letting her guard fall. Julian glanced at the caller ID. "It's the hospital," he said. Brow furrowed, Clara's head snapped up. "My mom?" He shook his head. "No, it's Mercy General. I don't know anyone there." He answered, his face going pale within seconds. Clara saw the change immediately. "What is it?" Julian lowered the phone, his voice quiet. "My father. He's had a heart attack." There was no hesitation. Clara grabbed her bag. "Come on, I'll drive." The world flipped. Where once he'd been, the calm, capable one, behind the wheel, now he sat in stunned silence as she navigated traffic with sharp focus and quiet determination. At one red light, Clara reached across the console and gently took his hand, a single grounding gesture. At the hospital, the waiting room was a blur of tailored suits, board members, and whispers. Julian barely registered any of it, except the way Clara remained at his side, her presence a steady calm in the middle of the storm. When the doctor finally emerged, the news was measured but hopeful. Richard Ravelle had suffered a serious cardiac event, but he would recover with rest and surgery. "He's asking for you," the doctor said. "Just you." For now, Julian turned to Clara, his eyes uncertain. "Will you wait?" Clara nodded, her hand tightening briefly in his. "I'm not going anywhere. Take all the time you need." Inside the hospital room, the man Julian had spent a lifetime trying to impress looked strangely small beneath white sheets and blinking monitors. The crisp lines of power and control were gone, replaced by something frail, almost human. "Julian," Richard rasped. Julian moved to the chair beside him, his heart hammering. "You don't need to talk. The board can wait," he said softly, but Richard shook his head. "No, listen. Life. It's shorter than we think." He coughed lightly, eyes shining with something Julian wasn't used to seeing. Not command, but emotion. "I've made a lot of mistakes. Especially with you." Julian sat down. all his anger and armor, fading. For the first time. I'm listening. Richard looked at him. Really looked, and for the first time in years, something unspoken passed between father and son that had nothing to do with power or legacy. I saw myself in you, Richard whispered. And for Julian, those 5 words changed everything, the ambition. The fire in you, I recognized it, Richard Ravelle, murmured his voice, brittle with exhaustion. But I tried to shape you into my own reflection. That wasn't fair, he paused, chest rising with effort. Your mother always said you had her heart, not mine. You were meant to create, not just conquer, Julian. Sat in stunned silence. He couldn't remember the last time his father had spoken of his mother, not since the accident when Julian was 12. Her name had become a ghost in their house, just like the warmth that left with her. The girl, Richard, continued. The one out there, Julian blinked, Clara. She reminds me of Catherine, Richard said, and for a moment there was a faint, wistful smile on his lips. She was never impressed by wealth, just like this one. Julian nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. She's strong. Real. Do you love her? The question came without hesitation, so like his father, cutting to the heart without ceremony, and just as quickly, Julian answered. Yes, Richard exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath for years. Then don't waste time, he said simply. Life doesn't wait. When Julian returned to the waiting room, Clara was right where he'd left her, perched on the edge of the worn, blue couch, surrounded by executives and board members. Somehow, despite the sterile lighting and stiff chairs, she had managed to charm the room with little more than sincerity. Her eyes found him. Immediately, how is he stable? Julian said, running a hand through his hair, stubborn and weirdly philosophical. Clara tilted her head. That bad, huh? Julian chuckled. He asked about you. Me. He said you remind him of my mother. Clara raised her eyebrows. Is that good? Julian nodded. It's the highest compliment he's ever given anyone. There was a shift in the room, though everything around them stayed still. He also asked, if I love you, Julian said quietly. Clara's breath caught her entire frame. Going still, and what did you say? Julian took a small step closer, the hospital buzzing quietly around them. The moment was plain, unremarkable, in its surroundings, yet monumental in every other way. I told him the truth, he said simply. That I do. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a voice interrupted Mr. Ravelle. A nurse called from the hallway. Julian gave her an apologetic smile, touching her hand gently. I'll be right back. As he turned, he looked over his shoulder. She hadn't moved. She stood there watching him, 100 thoughts flickering behind her eyes, but she stayed, and for Julian that meant more than any words could. 6 months later, sunlight spilled into Chapter 1, the flagship store of the Ravelle and Hayes Literary Cafe. The space was warm, welcoming a perfect blend of Clara's soul and Julian's vision. Books lined every wall. Velvet armchairs, nestled beside hanging plants. A coffee bar buzzed with energy as staff prepped for the grand opening. In the upstairs office, Clara paced with purpose, fidgeting with flower arrangements and realigning stacks of curated titles. If you move that novel one more time, I think it's going to sue you for harassment, Julian called from the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. Clara looked up, her anxious expression breaking into a reluctant smile. Did the beanbags for the kids' reading room arrive? Yes, and the custom signage for the poetry nook installed yesterday. She opened her mouth again, but Julian was already by her side, placing a cup in her hand. Moonlit caramel, he said softly, exactly how you like it. Clara closed her eyes and inhaled. I can't believe we actually pulled this off. I can, Julian replied. From the moment you said yes, I never doubted it. Yes, that memory clung like mist to a quiet night. The one in the hospital after Julian's father collapsed, the moment when everything shifted. That night, after the doctor had called him away, Julian spent hours at Richard Ravelle's bedside, navigating medical decisions, asking impossible questions, signing forms with trembling hands. By the time he stepped back into the waiting room at 3:00 a.m., utterly drained, he was sure Clara would be long gone. But there she was, curled into a chair, arms wrapped around herself, fast asleep, beneath the fluorescent lights. She'd declined every offer to be driven home, waiting in stubborn silence. She stirred when he drew near, instantly awake. What happened? Is he okay? He'll need bypass surgery, Julian said, sinking into the chair beside her. But the doctors are optimistic. They're operating in the morning. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world was too quiet. Then Clara turned slightly toward him. Earlier, before we were interrupted, you said something. Julian gave a slow nod. He didn't have the energy to filter it. I said that I love you. She took a deep breath. Julian, we barely know each other, maybe 12 hours together. Tops, and half of that has been in hospitals. I know, he murmured, bracing for her rejection. Let me finish, she said gently. I don't believe in love at first sight. Attraction, sure. Chemistry, absolutely. But love. She exhaled. Love is earned. It's built brick by brick, through trust and time and showing up when it's hard. Julian looked at her, then heart quiet, but she continued softer now. I believe we could get there. I believe I could love you one day. If you're real, if you're patient, if you're the man I think you might be underneath the suits and the headlines. I want to be that man, he'd told her, simply and honestly, that made her smile, a real smile. The kind she'd never given him before. Then let's start where it matters, she'd said, with the cafe. Partners. Let's build something and see where it takes us. Partners Julian had agreed, offering his hand, but instead of shaking it, Clara leaned forward and kissed him just once, soft, sure, and full of possibilities. Now go sleep, she'd whispered. I'll be here in the morning. And in that stark hospital waiting room where most stories end, something real, something lasting had quietly begun. Penny, for your thoughts. Clara's voice broke into the present. Julian smiled as he looked out over the cafe floor below them. Just thinking about that night, he said, how strange and perfect it was. They stood together in the upstairs office of Chapter 1, the flagship Ravelle and Hayes literary cafe. 6 months had passed since that moment in the hospital. 6 months of slow building something strong. They had become not just business partners, but partners in the truest sense. Their skills fit together in ways neither had expected, his vision and reach, her groundedness and heart. Business meetings turned into late-night conversations, quiet dinners, book swaps, shared silence. Somewhere along the line, the walls fell and love slipped in without fanfare. My dad arrives in 10 minutes, Clara said, checking her watch. You sure you're ready for his inspection? Julian let out a breath. It's not your dad I'm worried about. It's your mother, Clara laughed. Elena already adores you. She just likes watching you squirm. Since his surgery, Richard Ravelle had stepped back from the reins of empire, choosing instead the quieter post of chairman. Their relationship was still cautious, but growing. Julian worked remotely, splitting time between his old world and this new one, a world with bookshelves and coffee beans and meaningful mornings, and Clara, and soon, everything they'd built together would be open to the world. Ever since you swapped out that dreadful hospital chair for one she could actually nap in, Clara joked, smoothing the front of her blouse. Julian smirked, though he couldn't hide the pride flickering in his eyes. Helena Hayes, Clara's fiercely protective mother, had become a quiet but steady presence in his life over the past few months, something maternal and grounding in a way he hadn't realized. He'd been craving a knock. Broke the moment Harrison leaned in, phone in hand. Press is setting up outside, and the mayor just confirmed she'll be cutting the ribbon. Julian nodded. We'll be down in 5. When the door shut, again he turned to Clara, suddenly serious. Before we head into the chaos, there's something I need to say. Clara raised an eyebrow, setting down her coffee. "You're not about to back out, are you? Because I poured my entire inheritance into this venture." He let out a soft laugh. "No. Cold feet. Quite the opposite." He reached for her hands, grounding himself in the way her fingers laced so naturally with his. 6 months ago, he began, I walked into that little cafe, convinced the world owed me something, that I could have whatever or whoever I wanted. I was arrogant, entitled. Clara smirked. "Well, at least you're self-aware now. I deserved your rejection," Julian admitted. "But I'll never stop being grateful for every second chance you gave me after that, probably a dozen of them." Honestly, she teased, it was the book's any man who voluntarily tackles Dostoevsky has to have layers. He chuckled, but then met her eyes, his voice lowering. "What I'm trying to say is, I'm not standing here as Julian Ravelle, the billionaire. I'm just Julian, your partner, your friend, and I hope the man you've grown to love." Clara's teasing melted into a look of quiet tenderness. "You know I have," Julian reached into his jacket, suddenly nervous. Then, "There's something I'd like to ask you." He produced a small velvet box and opened it, but instead of a ring inside, was a single silver key, delicate and polished. Clara blinked, caught between curiosity and disbelief. "This isn't a proposal," Julian clarified quickly. "Not yet. I know you, 6 months, would feel rushed. But this is an invitation." She stared at the key, then at him. "I sold the penthouse," he continued. "Bought a brownstone in your neighborhood, with bookshelves. A ridiculous number of bookshelves." Her lips parted, her expression unreadable. "There's space for your mom, too, if she wants a whole-floor private elevator, a garden even," she mentioned. "Missing that, Julian." She started, voice soft. "Are you sure?" she asked, her hand hovering over the key, trading high-rise glass and rooftop views for creaky stairs and old trees. "That's not nothing," he smiled. "When I'm with you, the address doesn't matter. You're what makes a place home." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, catching the light, she said, voice shaking with emotion. "For a ruthless empire builder, you can be dangerously sweet, only with you," he whispered. He held the key out again. "So, what do you say? Business partners? Life partners?" Clara took the key, her fingers wrapping around it with gentle certainty. Yes, that one syllable carried more than agreement. It held trust, intention, and the beginning of something deeper. Julian pulled her into his arms, kissing her like the man he never knew he wanted to become. When they finally parted, flushed and laughing, Clara whispered, "We should probably get downstairs before someone sends a search party." "Let them wait," Julian said, but he offered her his arm anyway, the gesture of a man who knew what mattered and was ready to walk beside her, no matter what came next. "One more thing," Julian said softly, still holding her close. "This isn't a proposal, not yet, but I want you to know, when the time is right, when you're ready, I will ask." Clara tilted her head, eyes glinting with mischief. "Careful, Mr. Ravelle. I might just beat you to it," Julian laughed, his grin bright and boyish. "Always keeping me on edge. That's just one of 1,000 reasons I love you." Fingers interlaced, they walked side by side, out of the office and down the staircase that overlooked everything they had created. Below, the grand opening of Chapter 1 was already in full swing, the cafe buzzing with laughter and clinking glasses. There were journalists and local celebrities. Yes, but also Clara's former literacy students, neighborhood kids, clutching free books, Clara Hayes, beaming proudly from her favorite seat near the espresso bar, and even Richard Ravelle, gracious and sociable, chatting with Harrison over mocktails. Clara squeezed his hand. "Look at this. Look at what we built." Julian took in the scene, the scent of coffee and fresh paper, the shelves filled with titles they'd hand-picked, the soft lighting designed to make people stay a little longer, read a little more. He looked at Clara. "This," he said with quiet conviction, "is only the beginning." And when they stepped onto the floor and the crowd erupted into applause, Julian felt something deeper than pride. He felt home. 1 year later, Clara stood behind the counter of Chapter 1, frothing oat milk for a moonlight mocha, her signature still the best-selling drink on the menu. The cafe had grown faster than they dared to hope. 2 more locations had opened, 3 more were in development. But this place, the original, was still her favorite. It carried memories in every corner, echoes of quiet beginnings and small miracles. She and Julian had settled into the brownstone nearby, with Elena creating a house filled with sunlight stories and the kind of love that didn't need to shout. To be real love in burnt toast on lazy Sundays, love in post-it notes, left in book margins, love in listening and apologizing and showing up. As Clara slid the drink across the counter, her hand brushed something unexpected, a leather-bound book that hadn't been there a moment ago. She looked down. It was The Memory Divide, the same novel Julian had once admitted unsettled him, the one that cracked open their very first real conversation. For a valued customer came a familiar voice from behind her. She turned, and there he was, Julian in jeans and a button-down, sleeves rolled, looking like the man she'd built a life with, not the billionaire who used to rule the skyline, but the reader, the dreamer, the builder of cafes and quiet revolutions. Mr. Ravelle, Clara said with mock severity, "You know the rules." Orders at the front counter. His eyes danced with amusement. Some rules were made to be rewritten. "Not in my cafe, our cafe," he corrected gently, reaching across the counter to take her hand, then more quietly, "Though I was hoping to discuss a new kind of partnership today." She raised an eyebrow. "If this is another surprise, expansion, you're in trouble." Julian shook his head, then nodded toward the book. Something a bit more personal. Curious Clara flipped open the cover. Inside, where the title page should have been, was a handwritten note. "Clara Hayes, you taught me to look beyond balance sheets and borrowed power to see what matters and who matters. You challenged me to become better and loved me patiently until I did. So, now I ask you, not as your business partner, but as your forever teammate, will you keep building this life with me?" Clara looked up, heart-thundering tears catching in her lashes. Julian was already rounding the counter, kneeling, not with a ring, but with his heart open and his voice steady. "Clara," he said, "will you marry me?" For a long, quiet second, she just stood there, overwhelmed by the weight of how far they'd come. Then, without hesitation, she whispered the only word that mattered. "Yes." For a lifetime, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the quiet hush that had fallen across the cafe. Julian smiled, steady and certain. "Yours always." When Clara looked up startled, she found him already in front of the counter, dropping down on one knee, a small velvet box resting in his open palm. Inside, cradled in satin, was a simple yet breathtaking diamond ring. Her breath caught. "Is this what I think it is?" Julian's mouth quirked into a familiar, tender smile. "The one he saved only for her depends," he said, voice low but laced with emotion. "If you think it's me asking you to spend forever with me, then yes, that's exactly what it is." Clara glanced around at Elena, dabbing tears from her cheeks, at Harrison, grinning like a fool, while trying to discreetly film from the corner at the other customers, watching with quiet, hopeful smiles. Then her gaze found Julian's again, and nothing else mattered. "You know," Clara said, a soft laugh, breaking the spell of silence, "I was planning to ask you next week." Julian's eyes widened in delighted surprise. "You were—" "I even bought a ring," she confessed, cheeks flushing. "It's hidden back at the brownstone." A laugh, pure and unrestrained, burst from Julian, a sound so filled with joy it wrapped around the entire room, like sunlight. "Always one step ahead of me," he teased. "Not this time." Clara whispered, her heart in her eyes, as she reached for him, pulling him gently to his feet. "Yes, Julian Ravelle. Yes, I will marry you as he slid the ring onto her hand, fitting as if it had always belonged there. The entire cafe erupted into applause, cheers rising around them like a benediction. Julian kissed her slow, reverent, full of promises. They didn't need to speak aloud. And when they finally broke apart, the world around them blurred into nothing but this moment, this love, this life they had chosen to build together. In the middle of the little cafe, where it had all begun, Clara realized something simple and true. The greatest stories aren't written in boardrooms or headlines. They are lived, hand in hand, heart to heart, day after beautiful day. And so, as they stood there, partners in life and in dreams, Claire and Julian knew the chapters ahead were still unwritten. But whatever pages awaited them, they would write them together with love, with courage, and with a joy that even time itself could never erase. Because the best kind of forever begins with choosing each other every single day. Thank you for walking through this story with us, for believing in love that grows slowly, patiently, and beautifully. Every chapter we've shared is a reminder that the most extraordinary journeys often begin with the simplest moments: a conversation, a shared dream, a quiet act of courage. We hope this story touched your heart, reminded you of your own worth, and of the incredible magic that comes from choosing connection, kindness, and love. May you find your own forever. In friendships, in dreams, in every small, beautiful choice you make. Until our next story. Stay brave, stay hopeful, and never stop believing in the power of love. With all our hearts, thank you.